My name is Arun Majumdar. I'm a professor and dean of the Doerr School of Sustainability. And I just want to thank you all for coming for the Dean's Lecture Series. I want to start off by thanking our just fantastic staff who put all these together. Let's just give them a big round of applause. I also want to take a moment to talk a little bit about what this Dean's Lecture Series is all about. This lecture series was created to bring in thought leaders to speak about issues that does not fit neatly into individual departments, which will go to a naturally department seminar, but cuts across the board for the whole school and frankly for the whole campus. And today we have Emily Levine and Mitchell Stevens. What they'll talk about is like a tour de force of Stanford. And this is the history of Stanford. But this lecture series in the past have had people from a wide spectrum of thought leadership, from the president of Indonesia to a indigenous chief from the Amazonian forest, talking about environmental justice issues, et cetera. And if you look at that, I mean, and he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020. So, and there's been a lot of things in between. Today, Emily and Mitchell's talk is going to be really about the history of Stanford. And this is super important given the context of the Doerr School. And it's really important to understand that history to place the Doerr School in that historical context and see what do we need to do looking at the future. We are more than 2 years in. This is the third year that we're running. In between, there's a lot of things that have happened. We've had, I'll just rattle out some numbers. Some 6,000 students have taken our classes. We have hired 20 new faculty to the school. In fact, the 20th one signed on the dotted line today, and there are a few more in the making. We've had we have launched 2 new departments, the Oceans Department, Environmental Social Sciences Department, and we have had the Accelerator, which is a new thing that is in the process of launching a bunch of solutions. I can go on, but that's not the point. The point is to really listen to what Emily and Mitchell have to say. So without much ado, let me invite Mitchell and Emily, and I'm going to come back later on for a conversation and Q&A with the public. So here's to you.
Well, thank you, Arun. You've become our biggest fan, and I say that by way of apologizing to any of you who have heard us sing this song before. But we have had the opportunity to speak, to have remarks like this with a couple of parties in Doerr's leadership group, and it is a true honor to be able to continue this dialogue with you. It's a scholar's dream to have their work actually part of public discourse, and these are just exactly the kinds of conversations that Emily and I have been hoping to have. So thank you for having us. Emily and I have been working on this basic idea of the academic social contract for a couple of years now. We come at it from somewhat different disciplinary perspectives. Emily is a trained historian and I am a sociologist. And we both share something called historical social science, which means you don't have to choose between one methodological and analytic strategy or the other. So that's kind of where we are. That's our intellectual home. And we want to organize our discussion around an historical examination of Stanford's recent history. I remember recently we teach a class that Emily will talk about in a minute, and we asked them to think about what they know about Stanford's history. And one of the students said, I don't think about Stanford as having a history. which I came to see as an interesting fact and perhaps a problem that we may want to fix here. But our three big takeaways, not to bury the lead, first is that Stanford's excellence is a function of a deeply reciprocal relationship between the university and its many patrons. These are relationships that are mediated by this idea that we call the academic social contract. The second is that the university we inherit is an outcome. It's an outcome of two epochs of negotiating the contract, and this is one of the tricks of historical social science, is to see today as an outcome of a long history that shapes the present. And then we want to conclude by suggesting that the current moment requires a third epoch of negotiation, and we are both convinced that the outcome of the 2024 presidential elections sort of make that imperative to renegotiate all the more clear. So I'll turn it over to Emily. We're going to tag team a little.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thanks.
Yep.
Sort of a little relay here. Okay, so thank you, Mitchell. Thank you, Arun. And I echo Mitchell's gratitude and excitement about the opportunity to share our work and for this dialogue. Okay, so we will begin with the perhaps obvious, but we think important observation that universities are complex organizations. And Stanford has become ever more complex over the last 50 years. If we were economists and not social scientists, we might say that universities have a wide array of production functions to produce Nobel scientists, water polo players, and marriages. Public commentators often default, somewhat cynically, to a conception of universities as businesses or firms. And while we think there's some truth to this analogy, we believe it obscures what makes universities distinctive, especially powerful, and frankly, a little bit controversial. So to fill this theoretical gap, Mitchell and I have been developing a more rigorous social science of universities that accounts for this organizational complexity. Oh, and yes, and a favorite analogy, of course, is also that Stanford is a country, right? That's won more gold medals than most at the Olympics. Again, not false, but not the whole truth that reflects Stanford's role as a civic actor. And that's really what we're after here with this new social science. Sometimes we're even as bold to say that we're developing a political theory of universities as civic actors. And that political theory has two major components that are both grounded in paradoxes. And the first of these is that universities are both sanctuaries of learning, remote from the world, and also they are deeply intertwined with, even complicit in, the social and political affairs that happen outside their walls. And the second is that universities are both a part of and apart from their nation states. And I think often we hear arguments from promoters and critics alike that are equally strident in arguing for one or either side of these coins. But when it comes to universities, we want to suggest that both opposing truths are correct. And in fact, perhaps the paradox is a constitutive feature of this unique institution. So we've been working on our theory in a number of fronts. We've been writing about it, as one does around here. And as some of you know, as Mitchell just mentioned, I also see some former students in the audience. We've also been teaching about it. We've been developing this social science, most recently in our course, Stanford and Its Worlds, 1885 to the Present, which you can enroll in this spring, right, returning to a theater near you. The premise of Stanford and Its Worlds is really that Stanford has existed and been active in several domains at the same time in its history. And it's been active in shaping those domains and being shaped by those domains. And so most of these domains or worlds here in our framework are self-explanatory. By the American West, of course, we mean the incorporation of the western part of North America into the nation state. By the US nation state, we mean the formal apparatus of the federal government. The Global Academy requires a little bit more elaboration, and we'll come back to it at the end. Here we mean the international community and network of scholars, which sometimes is referred to as a republic of letters. And we'll see that even in its early years, Stanford was at the frontier of something much larger than itself, larger than the West or even the nation state. But that something's coordinates were not Washington, D.C., London, or Paris, but more like Göttingen, Madison, Wisconsin, and Oxford, England. The Global Academy is not the same thing as the global. And again, this is a tension I think we may want to explore later. And then, of course, there's in the fourth quadrant, the complex phenomenon that goes by the name Silicon Valley. And I'll just leave it at that and trust that you've all heard of it. Again, we'll return to it in just a bit. So the two-way arrows underscore the reciprocity among Stanford and its partners, patrons, and constituents in these worlds. And a central concept that we use to historicize this reciprocity is the academic social contract. So drawing on the idea of a political social contract, we see academic social contracts as relationships in which partners offer universities patronage, autonomy, and credibility in exchange for providing tangible services to society. And so the contractual terms have evolved over time, as we'll see, but the contract framework we suggest stays the same, and it has these key features. Something is exchanged, right? Sometimes it's inscribed in a founding document, as we'll see, or even a state constitution, but more often it's implicit or tacit. However implicit or tacit, there's still an expectation of tangible value, right? So consider this fact: Stanford receives 80% of its research funds from the federal government. We also get federal funding via Pell Grants. We get Cal Grants, federally backed student loans, and various tax exemptions that Mitchell will talk about. And in exchange for these subsidies, historically, Stanford has given different goods for the benefit of society. Sometimes that's been trained talent. Sometimes that's cutting-edge research. Other times, concrete defense research to fight wars. And then finally, these contracts, they don't negotiate themselves, right? They require leadership, action, even pro-action. And they're not, and as historians like to say, they're contingent, right? Which basically boils down to, it didn't have to happen this way, right? And it might not happen again. So the academic social contract is not limited to America. In fact, I first developed this concept in my historical account of the emergence of modern research universities in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century. And it also has policy implications for today. So together with our colleagues in Stanford Law School, we've been using the academic social contract as a foundation for a white paper that we've just published, Private Universities in the Public Interest, in which we argue that the social contract, the academic social contract, has prescriptive as well as descriptive power. Okay, so basically we argue that Stanford has had two primary contracts in at least 4 different worlds over its history. And we offer this framework to spark conversation about where we think that Stanford or the Doerr School might fit in this newest era. So, Stanford's first academic social contract was between Leland and Jane Stanford and the people of California. When the Stanfords founded Stanford University in 1885, the West was co-evolving with the newly unified nation after the Civil War, and it wasn't yet clear how the West would be settled. But there was an emerging pattern that institutions of higher education would be a part of that settlement, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why there's just so many colleges across our great country. So as we know, Leland Stanford accumulates enormous wealth building the transcontinental railroad, and he channels this power and ambition in 1869 into becoming a governor of California. But he also wants to make a statement with a philanthropic contribution, to put the West on the map, as it were, to make a there. And I think the architecture of the new university really exemplifies this aspirational and maybe even a little bit narcissistic gesture, because to outdo the East Coast establishment schools, he hires the 19th century starchitect Frederick Law Olmsted to design a magnificent campus. And one really gets the sense of the audacity of this endeavor. If you look either here or up close on your phones at the original memorial arch, it rose above 100 feet and featured a Roman-style frieze that depicts the Stanfords kind of arriving in Santa Clara County, right? It's not exactly subtle. And what we want to emphasize is that inscribed in this built environment that of course remains think of Palm Drive as you come up the drive and see Memorial Church, again, with this just magnificent, really unique view, is that it inscribes an academic social contract with a number of different dimensions. The Stanford family gives a gift of a cultural and academic institution to California to help establish the West as a worthy cultural destination. And in return, the Stanfords are given a legacy that continues to this day. In addition, he transforms his private wealth into a public good. And this is based on a reciprocal agreement with the people of California, and we might ask ourselves whether that continues to this day. You may have heard the story about how Leland is visited in a dream by his dead son, who tells him, educate the children of tomorrow, right? Educate the people of California as you would have educated me. Now, a contract with an apocryphal origin story negotiated in a dream with a dead son, I don't know. We have to ask our lawyer friends in the law school. I'm not sure if it's binding. But once the people of California vote to secure the 1900 amendment to the California Constitution, it certainly becomes tangible, right? And the amendment, which was the lobbying work of a prominent board member, George Crothers, has a few important consequences. First, the amendment ratifies the founding grant, making Stanford a legal entity, something only the state could do. It grants the Stanford trustees corporate powers and privileges. Now they could receive and administer gifts and other important things. And most important, I think, for our conversation today, it awards Stanford a real estate tax exemption in exchange for the university not charging tuition to who? The residents of California, right? So a state controller challenged the constitutionality of this special exemption in 1919, 1920, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been challenged since then. And I'm not sure, Mitchell, last I checked, I think Stanford charges tuition, but yeah, we'll check. Maybe the Doerr school doesn't, I don't know, that maybe. And this reciprocal relationship was also made explicit and written into the founding grant, in which Stanford further distinguishes itself from those East Coast establishment schools by emphasizing that education and knowledge will be useful. Right? So the founding grant, you may have seen this passage before, identifies the purposes of the university, spelling out an academic social contract to promote the welfare, public welfare, by exercising an influence in behalf of humanity and civilization. You might previously have stumbled over the in behalf, as I have, and wondered, why does it say in behalf and not on behalf? And according to a colleague more familiar with these linguistic formulations than I, this is because the latter means simply representing someone, while the former has the meaning of truly helping someone. So really pushing towards that contract notion. Now, this emphasis of usefulness was also new, and it was part of an idea emerging in the social sciences that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century, around when Stanford is being founded, that universities receive autonomy to develop expertise in exchange for not meddling in politics. But wait, expertise does meddle. In fact, that's the point of expertise, right? To not only understand, but also to change, or in our current parlance, to impact the world. And so that tension between understanding and changing the world was really at the root of the solidifying American academy. And the delicate way that that relationship was reconciled in the founding grant for this institution that's birthed exactly at this moment is one of the many paradoxes embodied in universities in general and in Stanford University specifically that continue to this day. So one final iconographic expression of this original contract is the Stanford seal. Did you ever wonder why Stanford has a German motto? That's German, by the way, yeah. Well, Jordan once wisely remarked that a motto should be short and in a foreign language, which I think is very wise. But there's another reason too. Stanford was an early adopter of the German research university model in the US. And this model, which originated, as I said, in the early 19th century in Berlin, it brought together these two tasks, the advancement of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge, that is research and teaching under one house, and it granted academic freedom in order to pursue objective truth. And when David Starr Jordan chose the German motto, Die Luft der Freiheit weht, the winds of freedom blow, with the image of the sequoia sempervirens, the redwood tree there at the center, it was really a bid for cultural prestige for the West Coast. He's saying, we are cosmopolitan and we are affiliated with the premier centers of knowledge of the day, which were in Germany. And Stanford would be grounded in that world, in that global academy, but also have its 2 feet on the ground through that tree in the American West. Now, finally, this first academic social contract, it really comes into its own in the 1920s, and this reciprocal relationship becomes embodied in one person, a new kind of civic actor, whom Mitchell and I have been calling an academic civil servant. And here I mean none other than Herbert Hoover. The university was established, according to Jane, to foster a new generation of these Leland-like figures who rise from modest backgrounds. And Hoover, who grew up an orphan from the Midwest, rose to become president, the first president of the United States to graduate from Stanford, is really in this mold. And he first establishes himself after graduating in industry as an engineer working in a London-based mining company in China, and like Leland Stanford, amasses great wealth. But he's also called to public service, and when Germany invades Belgium in World War I, he would make his name figuring out through public service, as a public servant, how to manage and organize and feed all of Europe. After running for president of the US the first time and then losing, he then makes the crucial decision to return to Stanford, where he builds the precursor to today's Hoover institution, donating a library for research, creating the center that brings together these worlds, industry, private university, and public service. And he purposefully does this in Palo Alto, at Stanford, and not in Washington, D.C. And so this tradition of the public servant industry leader Stanford man that Leland inaugurated culminates in Hoover. And Hoover also ignites a second chapter hinting at a new contracting partner, the federal government. And I will tee up my colleague here to tell you a little bit about that.
Any guesses who paid for Hoover Tower? Herbert Hoover paid for Hoover Tower. So contract 2. Now, US entry into World War II would massively expand the academic social contract and transform both universities and American society in the process. Wars tend to be transformative because they require the mobilization of so many resources. The US had never waged a combat on the scale of World War II, and it was scarcely prepared to do so in the 1930s. We had a widely distributed, weak polity. The New Deal itself had been a major expansion of the US state, but fighting global wars was not something we were a priori prepared to do, especially in the throes of a recession. Universities became essential vehicles for World War II mobilization for a bunch of reasons. One, they were all over the country. So if you wanted to recruit and train service people, you could do them on university and college campuses. They didn't look, sound, or feel like government to Americans, so they felt like kind of civically neutral spaces. They had much of what scientific and technological capacity the US had available at the time. And if you hadn't noticed, universities are perennially hungry for revenue. Perennially hungry for revenue. I asked, soon after I arrived at Stanford, I asked a senior member of the development office naively, I said, when do you decide we have enough money? And right away she said, oh, Mitchell, there's never enough money to match our ambitions, right? Never enough money, okay. And Stanford, like universities across the country, sort of saw the opportunity to be civic servants during World War II, and they really stepped up to the plate. One of my favorite examples about Stanford is, and one of the reasons that psychology remains such a strong social science at Stanford is that psychologists figured out early and well in both World War I and World War II how to use their handy-dandy tests to help the US defense machinery sort of manage the inflow and testing, assessment, and sorting of service people, and then to help those same people readjust, right, to civilian life. So it was, the imperative to fight the Cold War created a huge opportunity of patronage for universities, which is something that we really stepped up to the plate on during World War II. Herbert Hoover had laid the foundations for much of that in some interesting ways. Now, so capably did universities serve the nation during the war that Congress turned to them again at war's end to help absorb returning veterans. At its origin, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, otherwise known as the GI Bill, was a labor management tactic. There was a lot of anxiety. American elites had not figured out that the war had decimated the industrial bases of Asia and Europe, and so it would be a great time to manufacture automobiles and washing machines, right, for the rest of the world. But in 1944, that was not a foregone conclusion. There was anxiety that bringing a bunch of servicemen back without finding some accommodation for them would lead to substantial labor unrest. And so the GI Bill was really a kind of political management strategy, which worked extraordinarily well, in fact. Now, not only did it lay the foundation for ongoing massification of higher education from 1945 until 1980, it also changed the meaning of college. In 1940, fewer than 5% of adults in the United States went to college. It was just something that school teachers and scientists and a few rich athletes would do. But in the space of 50 years after 1944, the post-secondary credential would become not only a sine qua non for economic mobility, but really a badge of honor, right? Distinguishing a certain kind of and who were the most privileged people in the United States in 1944? White male veterans. Over 50% nearly 50% of whom hadn't graduated from high school by the time they went to war. So this was really tying the prestige of white men who had served in the war with the prestige of college, and Americans loved it. Now, another war was on its way. This is Fred Terman, the son of Lewis Terman. He's another academic civil servant that Emily talked about, the son of the famous and controversial psychologist Lewis Terman. The younger Terman trained as an engineer at MIT under Vannevar Bush. He returned to Stanford as a faculty member after his doctorate, then went back to Cambridge to serve in the radio lab that supported the war effort in World War II. And it's in Cambridge that he learned just how much science you could do if you were in the service of the military for the federal government in a global political conflict. And he wanted some of that action back in California. This event, I'll do this in a second. This is how ambitious this guy was. This is, why take a break from work on the 29th of December when you can, write a letter about your ambitions? He says here, The years after the war are going to be very important and also very critical ones for Stanford. I believe that we will either consolidate our potential strength and create a foundation for a position in the West somewhat analogous to that of Harvard. Who's heard of Harvard? Or we will drop to a level somewhat similar to that of Dartmouth. A well thought of institution having about 2% as much influence on national life as Harvard. So the guy's thinking big, right? Okay. He gets his chance with the Soviet successful launch of Sputnik into Earth's orbit in October of 1957. This scares the daylights out of every member of the national ruling class. Again, war creating an imperative for mobilization. Again, another opportunity for universities to step up to the plate, to be of service to the federal government. And the rest is history that you probably know in some fashion. Now, Fred Terman was not starting from zero in 1957. The Pacific Theater, the war in the Pacific Theater had created a great deal of industrial capacity in Southern California and the San Francisco Bay Area. There was a mature industries here to build on. But this was not regarded as a world center for academic or scientific research. It was really the 20th century Cold War that pumped often not necessarily well accounted for dollars into Stanford and the region. Another asset of the region at this time is it was really hard to surveil where and how the money moved around once you sent it to California, and so Terman and his colleagues were able to be very creative, shall we say, with what we now call public-private ventures. And the result is, again, this kind of economic and technological miracle that we call Silicon Valley. So our big point here is that this entire enterprise, the entire legacy that Stanford is very proud of, was seeded over multiple generations by a reciprocally beneficial contract between universities and the federal government, who for decades were conjoined in a shared task of waging global wars. And there are fantastic histories of these phenomena. One of our favorite is our very own Fred Turner's Counterculture to Cyberculture. Now, the story around here often ends with this miracle of Silicon Valley, but history has a way of sort of moving forward. And many of us now feel that we are at a really important and indeed pivotal moment in history. I'll emphasize 3 items and then turn it over to Emily, and then we'll be open for discussion. First of all, the massive project of college access that had begun in 1944 with the GI Bill and carried all the way through the Cold War period and got tied to the civil rights movements of the 1960s, which is something in our larger story that we tell with our colleague Rick Banks, who's now here. Many on the political left and center advocated a project called College for All as a national mantra for social mobility and civic vitality in this country. But we never got there, not nearly. The blue line on the top of this shows the proportion of Americans who have attained a high school diploma. And by 2022, we'd done pretty well in that regard by getting over 90% of Americans with that degree. But even at the height of the College for All era, we never really got substantially beyond a third of Americans possessing 4-year college degrees. And you don't need me to tell you this in 2024, but we have recognized over the last 15 years that possession or non-possession of a 4-year college degree has become a dividing line, indeed perhaps a Maginot line, in another war, a culture war, that divides people with and without college degrees, not only by social class and educational opportunity and general well-being, but also increasingly understood to be an epistemological divide. People who have 4-year college degrees think differently about the civic, right, than those who do not. And our current president has figured out a very compelling way to sort of mobilize the anxieties and disadvantages of those who are on the other side of that college divide. And of course, global politics continues to move as well. You don't need me to tell you about just how formidable the multifarious investments of other countries are in dramatically changing the context in which technological, diplomatic, and military competition will proceed going forward. So with that, I'll turn it back to Emily for some final provocations.
Great. So I think that the gist of our talk is that America kind of figured out Contract 1 and Contract 2 like as a pretty good story, I think. But part of what not perfect, but it's a pretty good story. And there were some really great historical figures who negotiated the really complex terrain to really create amazing achievements, including this very institution. But we haven't quite figured out the third chapter, the third contract. And given that the Doerr School is the newest wing of Stanford, it's opening now at this crucial moment to which Mitchell alluded, we sort of offer these thoughts and this historical intervention as a provocation for our exchange about what negotiating that third contract might look like. And at first, I think as Mitchell's sketch of the present implies, we haven't had a moment since World War II, certainly when higher education and the federal government were further apart, right? And so if Contract 1 and really Contract 2 at its apex were largely with the nation state, we suggest that Contract 3 may need to negotiate with other kinds of partners and patrons worldwide. Right. So that's one kind of suggestion. Two, as you may have noticed, wars were critical. They were critical for creating the conditions for the possibilities of these contracts. It wasn't a given they would happen. We argue that a confluence of events as well as proaction by these academic civil servants was required to create these institutions, but certainly if we have a war now, we are mobilizing, certainly in the context of Doerr, for a war of a different sort, right? And a war on climate change is different from either the hot or cold wars which appear in our story. And this war will probably require cooperation as well as competition, the porosity of state borders, and it will necessarily be global. Right? And then three, again, thinking about that divide that Mitchell was talking about, to which we arrive now here in 2024, a divide that's political as well as epistemic. Education and cultural change is as essential, we would suggest, for addressing the problems of climate science as is basic and applied research. So we would suggest humbly that the Doerr School can't just have cutting-edge research, because what good is groundbreaking innovations to solve the problem of climate change if only a little over a half of Americans believe that climate change is a problem, right? And I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. But I think that where we come to at the end of our story is that this epistemic and political divide today really requires that the American people at large see themselves in these institutions. And we think, true to Stanford's inheritance, Doerr will be both a civic and academic agent in that project. It'll be engaged in both understanding and changing the world. And history that we've shown, it shows this is challenging to navigate. Choices will have to be made. Global expansion potentially undermines the contract with the nation state, and expansion of education to learners outside Stanford's wall perhaps pulls us from the goals of research or education here on campus. We have no answers. We only have questions, but we hope that our historical and conceptual framework is helpful for this discussion. Thank you for letting us be a part of it.
Well, thank you very much for your insightful comments about Stanford's history, especially reminding us of the DNA of Stanford. And we have, I think, elements of that out here. We have some genes. We can see some of the genes in the DNA, but it's but the outside world has changed, as you pointed out. I have a few questions from the audience, but I just wanted to open with the idea that, yes, the Doerr School is 2 years in, the third year going on, and we have, as you pointed out, we have a fight against climate change, et cetera. This is different because in the first two social contract, it was shaped by conflict, and the people were on board because of U.S. competitiveness in fighting the war. In this case, we are not sure, as you pointed out, but there's a larger narrative out here, and that is the trust in higher education itself is being questioned right now. And I was wondering if you could comment on that as to how do we look at the social contract in the broader issue of trust, with climate being a piece of it.
You want to go first? Or you want
Sure. Start off with some general comments. Thank you again so much for having us and for this exchange. Yeah, I think that the decline of the trust in higher education institutions is directly and intimately related to the demise of Contract 2 and the fact that we haven't yet negotiated Contract 3. And in fact, Mitchell and I have written about this in a couple of different places in the New York Times in 2017 during the endowment tax controversy, and also with our colleague Ari Kelman a couple of years ago in the Washington Post when we were involved, when we were both on the first task force on anti-Semitism that looked at anti-Semitism and admissions in the 1950s, and we wrote a piece about how part of repairing that trust is about reintegrating historical consciousness, actually, reviving a sense, as you call it, of the DNA of an institution. And we speak here from Stanford, but all institutions are different, and all institutions will have different social contracts. We speak today about the specific one here. And in order to negotiate that contract in all of its complexity with all of Stanford's partners, you really have to have an understanding of the historical and institutional inheritance. So when we teach our class, Stanford and Its Worlds, first of all, we talk about institutional self-awareness as something that we want to convey to students, that they're not just passing through here in 4 years, but this is their inheritance, and they now get to decide kind of what to make of it. And so that sort of collaborative, ongoing reckoning of the past is a sort of a larger picture, I think, for me as a historian, for how we think about this, and that kind of connects the dots of some of these different projects.
And I will respond as well to that. I mean, Emily and I talk about this all the time with our colleagues nationally. We can't think of a time in American history where this failure of trust has ever been this deep. Now, higher education institutions were arguably peripheral institutions in American life until the 1940s, but that doesn't mean they weren't trusted, right? They weren't revered as civic spaces, right? So we've never been here before, and speaking as a sociologist, I see a couple of sort of core, kind of fundamental causes of that. One is that we have, as a society over the last 3 generations, we have created that Maginot line by tying so much opportunity to possession of a 4-year college degree, and essentially blaming people without that degree for not doing something right. They failed, they didn't make the right decision, life got in the way, and then there's that $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. We don't know whose fault that is. Is that Stanford's fault because we charged so much? Is it the government's fault because we extended the debt? Is it your fault because you took it out, right? Nobody has a clear answer to that question, right? So the fact that we invested so much social advantage in 4-year degrees at the expense of other pathways into you know, dignified lives, right, is one. And then the other is another historical contingency, that the current president just brilliantly figured out how to re-narrate that distinction as a problem that people like us created. And I don't think
You mean the president-elect?
of the president-elect, and
yeah.
I don't think he's entirely wrong. I don't think he's entirely wrong, because my entire field was organized around, you know, pushing as many people into college as possible, and telling people for generations that was good debt. I mean, if there's anything that keeps a sociologist up at night, it's something like that. So it's this widening inequality that's tied to college degrees, coupled with a brilliant politician, right, who has mobilized the resentment that creates.
Well, let me ask you as follow-up, going back to the 19th century, right in the middle of the Civil War, there was a Morrill Act of 1862, which led to land-grant universities with a different social contract. And that was to give access to education to the masses with an idea of mechanization of agriculture. And that led to all the network of state universities and Cal State.
We would call them economic development projects today. Right?
And they had extensions, right, in the communities out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's a different social contract than, for example, what we found. And they adopted, in fact, many of the social contracts that you talked about in response to the conflicts, et cetera. So I was wondering whether there are some lessons learned from the public school lessons that one should look at when we look at the future in terms of our own social contract. Do public schools have anything to tell us?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I love questions that begin back in the 19th century. So yeah, like I'm your girl for any of those. But yeah, no, I mean, one of the great hallmarks of American higher education was and has been its heterogeneity. So we're speaking here about Stanford and its social contract. That's why I wanted to make clear that every institution has its own kind of contract. And the reason why I think we like this framework, it really does work no matter the institution, because it doesn't matter if the patrons are the state or philanthropy, or, as is the case may be, usually a combination of both then and now, though we don't talk about that as much. There still is an exchange happening, and there's the assumption of reciprocity. And as you say, the agricultural and mechanical institutions founded in the 1860s and 70s had a very specific charge, right? To promote the agricultural and mechanical arts.
And they
to
have
do
a different
so.
DNA today.
Absolutely, and many of those continue to draw on that for, I think, rightly so, for current and future inspiration, as do the historically black colleges and universities, or the women's colleges, or the religious colleges. I think that with respect to the private-public divide, one of the things that Mitchell and I have talked a lot about and written about is that I think that we make a mistake if we say Stanford's private, so it's not like Berkeley. Like, it doesn't have the same obligations to California or the people of California, or the nation, or the world. And part of what we try to do, actually, in the policy paper that we've written with Rick Banks and his team and our colleagues in the law school, is that paper's called Private Universities in the Public Interest, because it's trying to actually surface that history to remind our readers and our colleagues and the public of just the outsized role that private universities played in the creation of American political culture and in state building, as I'm sure Mitchell will have something to say about, and that was part of an agreement, right? That they received and continue to receive massive subsidies in exchange for that role. So we've kind of obscured that history, and that's why this is a historical intervention as much as it is a policy conversation, is that we are trying to sort of surface a different historical understanding. And then hopefully the conclusion is that, well, as our economist colleague, who's a former president of a private university on an unnamed university on the East Coast says, universities get subsidies. What are they giving in return?
Right.
And I think that's the lesson, I think, to be learned, and the thing we really are trying to push in the policy conversation.
So there's a question, obviously, about,
Oops, sorry.
needless to say, about the election. And there's also a question about disadvantaged communities. And if you take the question of definition of disadvantage broadly, and especially after, first of all, this is the fourth time I'm hearing a talk, and every time I learn something new. But the first 3 times were before the election. This is the first time I'm hearing after the election. And I think the election is clear that there are some, as you pointed out, there's a mobilization there's a turning point in American history that's happening. So if you look at that, look at the communities out there, how should we think about the social contract moving forward broadly with climate and sustainability as a specific lever that we should be thinking about?
Why don't you start with the...
So a couple of thoughts here. I mean, the massification of higher education in the United States between 1945 and 1980 is a miracle. Like, that's not the sort of thing that happens in a highly decentralized, racially and ethno-linguistically segregated society that's skeptical of government. Like, that's not the sort of thing that's supposed to happen, right? The miracle of college expansion was that a wide plurality of Americans believed that it was okay for the state and federal governments to subsidize this huge plurality of schools. And I think there's a bunch of reasons why that worked. One was the Cold War unanimity, but another one was that it wasn't necessarily a government school. It was like Notre Dame de Namur, or Bob Jones University, or Luther College, right, or Stanford. It was your school that the government was subsidizing, right, not necessarily some, government thing, right? And the other was the ultimate magic trick, on my view, is that for multiple generations, there was this idea that college could be both inclusive and exclusive at the same time. Everyone could go to something called college, and there was this thing called Stanford, and this thing called San Jose State, and this thing called Cabrillo College, and they were wink, wink, all college, right? So even though there was a massive inequality in that system, right, there was still a sense that we were all kind of sharing something. And I think it's that sense of shared investment in something called college that broke down by the beginning of the 21st century, because you just couldn't ignore, right, how dramatically different an experience at the University of Phoenix was from Stanford University. And so I think if colleges and universities are going to help you guys do your thing in the United States, I think they need to be recognized as vehicles of civic empowerment for everybody. And can we get that everybody part back? I'm here to hope that we can, but I think we have to take on the fact that sense of colleges for all of us, not just for some of us. And those are great questions. I mean, I think I would just add a couple of points, and I'm sure I know we want to have a wider conversation. But then, first of all, yes. I mean, I think that thinking about Stanford and what it means to be a good neighbor and a good landlord is something we talk about. That is, these are parts of our worlds. We said it was at least 4 worlds, but we might include the Bay Area, the region, East Palo Alto, right? Like, there's all sorts of other worlds with which we engage. And so part of the point of, again, the history is to sort of surface the complexity and the interrelationship and interdependencies of those worlds. And Stanford, in order to re-trigger that sense of obligation for the people and the learners who are not necessarily the traditional ones to whom we've been attuned. I think that the second point that I'll say is just to come back to, for me, it's really also, I mean, maybe this is useful for thinking about Doerr School specifically and climate science. To me, it's really about closing that gap between research and teaching, between
the advancement of the frontier of knowledge, to use Vannevar Bush's term, and the dissemination of knowledge. And I like the analogy of public health that was made by a physicist and former Congressman Rush Holt in the introductory essay to the new publication of Vannevar Bush's 1945 Science, the Endless Frontier, in which he talks about, again, another historical contingency, that the decision that was made about how to organize research funding in the middle of the 20th century that led to the creation of the NSF and other organizations on which we still rely was really one in which the rich get richer, right? In which research goes to the best institutions, the already resource-rich institutions, because those are the ones poised to make the most advances in science and to produce the most excellence. But that wasn't always the idea. In fact, Bush's kind of opponent in the debates of the 1940s was a West Virginia senator by the name of Harley Kilgore, had a more democratic kind of New Deal populist idea that actually the goal of research was to expand scientific literacy. And Holt says that one of the great sort of costs of this is that, take the COVID vaccine, which was discovered in record time through this kind of Bush-inspired kind of organization of research funding. And yet, I think 1 in 5 Americans were persuaded by non-vaxxers not to take it, right? So this is why I ask the question, how good are the cutting-edge innovations in climate science and sustainability if nobody believes you? And I know that there's many people in the Doerr School who are already at work at closing that gap and working on mobilization. And I think that to me may be an important lesson for us to think about in the renegotiation of Contract 3.
Let's open it up for questions from the audience.
And if you could say who you are when you...
Yes, that would be...
So we know where to find you. We're looking for you.
I think Dave Weinstein.
Hi, I'm Dave Weinstein at the Doerr School, in charge of mobilization, actually. It appears that the social contract with regard to our peer schools in the East Coast is collapsing actually more quickly than it is for us.
More quickly
than it is for us here at Stanford, because they are getting more focus, more attention, more criticism, and we are actually being somewhat shielded from it. Is there any explanation that you have based on your research and the history of their social contracts relative to ours that might actually explain why we have been less impacted by this, this demise of the social contract than they have been, or are affected more slowly?
I have a couple of hunches, just hunches about that. One is that Stanford's distance from the metropole has long protected it. Right? It's harder to scrutinize something when it's on the other side of the continent, especially when it takes 5 days to get to the other side of the continent. That distance continues to protect Stanford, I think. That's one. Another is that Stanford, unlike the Harvards, Yales, Princetons, Penns of the world, only in the second half of the 20th century started thinking at all paternalistically about their relationship to this thing called the nation state, right? That's all those hard questions. That was for the East Coast. We're out here innovating, inventing stuff. We're technologists. We sort of left that, the academic responsibility to the nation to others. And one of the ways I think about this current moment is that, Stanford is now at the top of the heap, right? Like it is now in a position that in almost in basically every way rivals those schools. What does it do with that responsibility, right? Will it be willing to take the hit, or will it want to keep avoiding the hit, right, as long as it can? I think that's the question. That's why I'm glad I'm not the president and the provost of the university. The other is that we had an interim president when Virginia Fox called the hearings. That might have helped. Totally serious.
And
yeah.
I have this view that those schools actually contributed more directly to the building of what is considered to be the deep state, because the number of senior government officials that came out of those institutions over a long period of time typically tended to be larger than Stanford, and I wonder to what extent that is a backlash against those schools actually being the foundation of what's considered to be the deep state.
I think that chronology is also relevant because Stanford doesn't become the Stanford that we know today until the period that Mitchell described, in the 1950s and 1960s, very consciously by those academic entrepreneurs and academic civil servants, foremost among them Fred Terman. So, as we sometimes like to say, it was a regional, provincial school, like amidst some peach orchards, and horse farms, which beautiful, yes, but peripheral, definitely. And so that also, I think, kind of protected it from some of the mythology about the relationship between the East Coast establishment universities and the creation of the state, the creation of the New Deal. I mean, that was Harvard, really, and the state, right? So there is that. And for a long time, Stanford was kind of insulated from the kind of the urban and racial and political strife of the cities. I mean, as our friend Margaret O'Mara writes about in her book, City of Knowledge, right? It's really suburbs of knowledge, right? I mean, it wasn't fighting kind of really challenging civil rights, urban
deindustrialization,
battles, right? As like University of Pennsylvania was, Chicago, Yale, and so forth. And in fact, scholarship has shown this is one of the reasons that it was able to seed Silicon Valley in the way it did, and then also efface the origins of the great federal government's involvement in that, right? So it's a great question, and we hope that surfacing, I think, this history and using it to spark the dialogue will also get us thinking about what that obligation is.
And what I appreciate about these conversations, and we try to stress for our students too, is that that universities are actors in history. They are actors in history. There is no Stanford without the federal government and the state of California, right? But there's no U.S. nation state without colleges and universities, right? So it's not as if we can sit here and insulate ourselves from these existential challenges. Like, we helped to create those existential challenges, and we have no choice, on my view, but to somehow be active in navigating the next chapter. We just don't have a choice. We have to engage.
Question over there.
Hi, I'm Sarina Patel. I do policy and engagement for the Woods Institute.
Great.
And actually, sort of tying into that, I'm thinking about there's sort of a debate within scholarship about the politicization that academics should engage in. And then we also have this cultural situation where there's already a politicization of science. And so there's a sort of philosophical war about how much we should be trying to affect the way that we govern as academic institutions or as members of the academic community, in contrast to sort of being held as an objective authority that is separate from politics. And I'm wondering, as we sort of negotiate this third contract, in an environment where college education, scholarship, and science in general is already politicized, how do we think about the academic engagement in public life?
Yeah, that's a good question. Really, really good question.
I think you need an entire university to answer that question.
So I'll say one thing, which is that, and this is why both I envy you and don't envy you here in this room, because I think that in different chapters in which that debate has been waged, right? What is the relationship between ideas and politics? Is there something like objective truth seeking, right, independent of the mind and outside of like politics, or is it simply an expression thereof? A different discipline has been on the front lines of that of that debate. And I was talking about at the beginning of the 20th century, the social sciences was really the discipline where the early fights about academic freedom were waged, right? That was because that was the discipline in which truth was not yet settled, and there weren't clear conventions, and there wasn't agreed upon methodology, and so. And yet there was great belief in faith and science and its ability to help us understand the world, and then therefore build it and improve it, right? Mitchell talked about psychology in the 1920s, and then of course engineering in the 1960s. So we might say that climate science is precisely that kind of frontier right now, right?
That's really good.
Sort of in these border fields, where truth is not settled and where the field is being defined is precisely where you have the most, the most controversy, but also the most important conversations happening, because it's there where the boundaries will once again be redrawn. See how I didn't answer your question, but just sort of like restated it in a less eloquent way?
It's really good.
My staff is telling me it's time, but this is such an exciting and interesting dialogue. Just one quick question, if you don't mind. You mentioned that we are far away from Washington, D.C., yet we have 4 former cabinet members at Stanford, and many sub-cabinet members as well. But the question is more looking west. We are on the Pacific Rim. Asia undoubtedly is going to be a major force in the 21st century, both in terms of people, issues, capital, et cetera, right? And as you look at the international side, which the Stanford brand is amazingly strong out there, it is international, it is not a domestic, but U.S. and international, they cannot be discussed. So is there a role out here in terms of a social contract that we look at it from an international point of view?
Oh, absolutely. And we both have, I'm sure we'll both have something to say about that. Emily and I also refer to universities as quasi-sovereigns. They're kind of like states, right? Like even in the United States, they even engage in ceremonial gladiatorial warfare with each other, right? They have special heraldry, we have citizenship rights, and they have these sort of state-like characters, and they are always, they're never fully a part of states, a particular state, and so they have a peculiar capacity to negotiate relationships with other sovereigns all over the world, which they have done with great alacrity. But here's the problem: if the more patrons you add, the more mouths you have to feed. And then perhaps the angrier your original master patron becomes, which is really what we're seeing now, right? Like, are you taking too much China? Is there too much China in the mix, right? And so one of the great challenges, again, of university leaders like yourself is like, how do you manage the sort of legacy patronage that we have to the US federal government while also building the kinds of patronage relationships you need with all sorts of other states, right? Huge, huge questions of diplomacy.
Yeah, and I think this is why I sort of, I dropped that smoking gun that the global was not the same as the global academy.
That's right. Sometimes
these work together and are in service of the same interests, and definitely during wars we see universities reorient to sort of to make their scientific advancements, promote their nations.
Right.
But in peacetime, we think more about the cosmopolitan international kind of network of scholars that's collaborating across countries and industries and universities to discover vaccines and fight climate science and so forth, but those are not always aligned, and I think that is the real challenge, is keeping those different value systems, but both alive, but also not giving in to the demands to close borders when it's clear historically that the porosity of borders and the exchange of ideas and the influx of individuals is really, really important to the advancement of knowledge.
Well, please join me in thanking Emily and Mitchell.